Hello, listeners. Welcome to another episode of Geopolitical Cousins. In this episode, Marco and I break apart some of the myths and bad reporting and bad takes that have been out there about the U.S. Attack on Venezuela, kidnapping of Maduro, whatever you want to call it. We also start at the beginning talking a little bit about the timing of the U.S. attack and also what's next. Is it Cuba? Is it Greenland? Is it Mexico? Is it Iran? And what does it mean for everything? You can write to me at jacob@jacobshapiro.com if you want to send us anything for our future mailbags, questions, comments, concerns, recommendations, whatever. Otherwise, share the podcast with everyone, please. If you're a new listener, we've got lots of new listeners coming in because of all the attention on this. Please share it widely. The more you listen, the more we do. Take care of each other. We'll see you out there. All right, Marco, we're back at it. I think we're going to talk every day this week. This is great for me. I'm having a good time. Did you see, by the way, that our listeners have sent us that you can? I didn't know this. Maybe you already knew this. You can still play Age of Empires online. My productivity just tanked. You're not going to see any more analysis from me on Venezuela. I'm going to be too busy.
That is funny. I did not see that, but that's awesome.
Yeah, I'm going to be in there. One of my underappreciated favorites was Age of Mythology. Did you ever play Age of Mythology? It was like Age of Empires, but when you got to a certain level, like you picked either Egyptian civilization or Greek civilization, and if you got to like boss level, like you'd have like a minotaur that would come and destroy the Egyptians thing, or Isis would come herself and like destroy. I really liked it. Anyway,
I did not, but I was a big fan of Civilization series. That was the one that probably like could have taken my life in a completely different direction.
And then if you want to get truly nerdy, of course, the Star Trek Armada video game series was basically Age of Empires, except in Star Trek land. So you could be Romulan or Klingon, and instead of villagers going to the forest, you were going to different planets, and you were mining dilithium. And
Well, this brings up the fact that we will record an entire episode just on this, the most geopolitical computer games / video games. That is coming. I just do want to line up a special guest for that. So I have someone in mind. I've already talked to him. He's super willing to do this, but we just have to kind of nail it down. But yes, that is something that we should definitely do.
It's amazing. And also, I mean, there are tons of people out there who make like literally millions of dollars playing video games for a living. I'm sure, cousin, that we could charge people for the pleasure of playing Age of Empires against us, and we could shit talk them the whole time and show them what a true geopolitical analyst does.
You know, that's a really, really cool like. That's like a niche request, but I will do it. I'll play. I mean, I'll get my ass handed to me. I was never a big Age of Empires. Actually, I really suck at computer games anyways. Like in a competitive sense, I'm not good, but I do enjoy a good Civilization 4 mod. I went down the rabbit hole of actually downloading like mod maps, and one of them I remember was medieval Europe, and it was so detailed and so good and so exact. Like the people who made this mod literally studied academic work for where they should like put resources on the map, and I kept trying to be the Byzantine Empire and survive the onslaught, and and it was awesome. It was really, really good.
Yeah, the upper level of this was we were on an interview yesterday with Maggie Lake over at Wealthion, and the coming war with Japan came up. We were both trained by George, and towards the end of my career at Geopolitical Futures with George, I would actually go over to his house, and we would not play Age of Empires, but we would play tabletop war games. In particular, our favorite to play was D-Day. And actually, there's a podcast like before even I started my first podcast when I was doing the GPF podcast where we talk through like tabletop war games. Tabletop war games are also extremely fun. And to your point about like sort of grandmaster shit, I would try to beat George in D-Day and he would kick my ass every single time. Like it was easy. I thought it was going to be easy to compete against him, but he had the whole thing like wrapped around it. It was actually quite an education.
Well, who was who?
I tried both. I mean, it was obviously much harder in the war game to be the allies. It was almost impossible. The deck is completely stacked against you because when you actually think about what the allies did on D-Day, I mean, it was absolutely insane. If any of you listening have not done this, go to Normandy at low tide and walk the beach, walk from the water to where they had to scale. And then you'll never complain about anything that's happening in your life ever again. The people who had to do that, I mean, the balls, the courage, it's like absolutely astounding. Anyway. Okay, we could talk all day about video games, but we're here to break apart some myths about sort of the coverage of Venezuela going forward. Cousin, I haven't even told you this, but our producer has also said that he wants us to start doing a segment that is like worst take of the week, where we take
Oh,
somebody's
that's
take and just completely obliterate it. So it's good that you suggested this. You're going to bring 3 myths to the table. I'm going to bring 3 myths to the table. But before we dive into that fun exercise, I know that you wanted to talk a little bit about the timing of this. Why did the Trump administration do this now? I wanted to talk a little bit about what's next. I obviously put out a piece on my Substack about I think that Cuba is the main course. But if you listened to Stephen Miller last night yelling at Jake Tapper, or if you've listened to Donald Trump saying things lately, they're talking an awful lot about Greenland. And Denmark is out there saying, please don't touch Greenland. And the United States is basically saying, we're going to take Greenland like in the next couple of days. I'm basically paraphrasing the president there. You've also had a war of words between our girl, Claudia Sheinbaum, and President Trump. Mexico has become one of the most outspoken critics of what the U.S. did in Venezuela. Really interesting to see how she's going to walk that tightrope. You've got the Trump administration now bringing up, okay, well, the U.S. is going to go after the cartels. The situation in Mexico is unacceptable too. And then Iran is floating out there too. So I wanted to bring that up. But why don't we start with you? Tell us about the timing of all this and what you think about it.
I don't want to reach for the headgear for the conspiracy, Marco, but this is kind of conspiratorial, and I believe that I brought this up on one of our pods late last year, which is that, Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, did come to Washington in November, I believe. There was a meeting between him and Donald Trump, and my suspicion was that, MBS told Trump, or tried to tell him, the fiscal realities of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is a country that's now in a current account deficit, which is pretty shocking for a massive commodity producer. So that means that more money is leaving the country than it's coming in. Partly the reason for that is that they're not getting as much back for their oil barrels in terms of US dollars. But their imports are still very elevated because the whole economic project going on in Saudi Arabia is about industrialization. And this is something that a lot of people, I think, misunderstand. They think that MBS is just building these like shiny new cities in the desert. There's a whole lot of other things that are being built, including, capex for industrial enterprises, roads, ports. There's a lot going on in Saudi Arabia, and the current price of oil is just too low. Which, of course, then begs the question, well, why is Saudi Arabia pumping, maximum amount of oil? OPEC, which is the cartel that controls basically oil supply in the world, has been boosting production for most of 2025. So when people talk about oversupply in the oil market, it's really a decision by one country. So why is Saudi Arabia effectively shooting itself in the foot with its production quotas? And there's an economic explanation for that. Saudi Arabia does this once or twice or three times a decade. It's a way to shake out the tree, shake the weaker producers around the world, whether it's offshore Nigeria, whether it's tar sands in Canada. Those producers
Russia.
can't really, shale. They can't produce at these levels, at these prices. So Saudi Arabia likes to shake the tree and, just literally force some of them out of the business. So that is the economic logic for it. But I think there's another logic, and that other logic is that Saudi Arabia is just trying to help Donald Trump keep CPI, keep inflation low. The problem is it can't do that forever, and there was media coverage of the meeting between MBS and Trump, and apparently some of the media focused on the fact that they got into a little bit of a tiff over Gaza, Israel, US support for Israel, and so on. Maybe my conspiracy, Marco, sort of view on this is that Crown Prince MBS just told Trump, hey man, listen, I gave you 12 months of low oil prices. We're going to have to start drifting those oil prices higher. And of course, President Trump is not cool with that because he needs another 12 months because of the midterms. The midterms are not looking great. I think President Trump expected that with equities at all-time highs, with 2 quarters worth of stellar economic growth, that he would be swimming in good approval ratings. And he's not. And the affordability crisis, quote unquote, is now the biggest issue in the world. The last thing he needs is oil prices to go up 20, 30% because Saudi Arabia decides to rationalize its production. And so I think that the urgency on Venezuela is really prompted by this. is prompted by the fact not so much that President Trump is mistaken that he can boost Venezuelan oil supply quickly. I don't think he ignores the reality. I just think that he needs to be seen as doing something profound to find new sources of supply. So that it, so that when if and when oil prices go up, if OPEC changes its quotas over the next 6 to 12 months, President Trump can say like, yeah, but I anticipated that. And look, we had regime change or soft regime change in Venezuela, and we're working our way to finding alternatives. So we don't have to depend on Riyadh's generosity and benevolence. I think that that's really what's going on. And the reason this is important, of course, is that if you're an investor, if you're a trader, if you're sitting there and you're saying like, oh, well, oil prices should go lower because there's already oversupply and because Venezuela just had regime change, maybe. But if the trigger for the actual intervention itself is the risk of higher oil prices, then I'm not sure that that's necessarily the directionality of prices over the course, at least of the next 6 to 12 months.
Yeah, I hear you. I mean, I'm sure you've read all the reporting about how the immediate cause of the operation seems to have been Maduro making fun of President Trump, dancing like him in the palace at Miraflores and calling him a coward and telling him to come get him, which is a very different sort of. It has nothing to do with oil or Saudi Arabia or grand strategy or hemispheric doctrines. It just has to be with he got his feelings hurt and he wanted to take down Maduro, which is why I mentioned this yesterday. The fact that Gustavo Petro is out there basically doing the same thing to President Trump, taunting him, calling him a coward, telling him to come get him, take some stones to push that through. I don't know. The last time the Saudis engaged in the sort of price war that you're talking about, I remember it vividly because it was basically a week or two before the COVID shutdowns. And if not for COVID, the Saudi-Russia oil price war probably would have been the biggest geopolitical story of 2020 going into it, because the Saudis wanted to get the Russians out and wanted to bring the Russian oil industry to its knees, and they were willing to hang out with $20 barrel oil or $30 barrel oil. So I take your point there. The Saudis also have a lot of. I mean, they I know they're burning through reserves like crazy, but they do have a lot of money. Like they can burn through like quite a bit and still just be fine. So I don't know. It feels a little too windy for me, but I hear you. I mean, it's definitely part of the conversation. I also don't know how to square what you're talking about with the fact that basically everything I've read, and neither you or I are petroleum engineers, but everything I've read says it's going to be impossible for Venezuela to really affect the market in any meaningful way for years. I mean, maybe you get some, oil out of sanctions. Maybe Chevron, which has continuous operations there, can pump a little bit more. But you're talking about relatively small changes around the edges, or at least that's kind of what it seems like to me.
Well, I think that in speaking with some folks who do just this for a living, um, if you actually look at on water oversupply and inventory of oil, so this is stuff that's just floating, oil barrels that are effectively on tankers, just floating offshore, waiting to be unloaded. We
Hmm.
have the largest oversupply since COVID, since the 2020 year you reference. And so even just removing sanctions on Venezuela, that in of itself, even if it just brings online 300,000 to 500,000 barrels, which is nothing, by the way. If you're listening, you know nothing about this stuff. We're talking about less than 1% of global supply just comes online. It could tip prices lower. So that's where that's why I agree with you, and I think that was the first myth I was going to bring to our discussion today.
Hmm.
This idea that Venezuela can meaningfully help solve America's affordability crisis. Total nonsense. In fact, if Saudi Arabia decides to change its production policy, as I suspect they will over the next 12 months, if they do that, it won't really matter what happens in Venezuela because, Venezuela is really a 5 to 10 year thing. Nonetheless, we are in such an oversupply market right now that, even just sanction relief against Venezuela could perhaps change this dynamic, which goes back to Saudi Arabia. To me, if you want to forecast oil prices over the next 12 months, it's far more important what happens in Saudi Arabia. It's far more important to understand just what their fiscal priorities are and why I think oil prices are $20, $25 less than what they minimally would want.
Hmm.
And that's why I think That is the most important dynamic over the next 12 months. And then, of course, the other dynamic is what you wanted to talk about. So maybe that's a good lead in into that, which is who's next. If it's Cuba, if President Trump is enamored with what just happened, if the Chuck Norris premium, if we've discussed, is out there, I think that that won't matter really for global markets. It'll be interesting. It'll be geopolitically obviously relevant, but I think obviously if Iran is next, and there's a lot of chatter on this. I gotta say, most of the time I just ignore the chatter. Like I don't base my day job on chatter, but there's overwhelming amount of chatter that Iran is truly going to be put under the microscope, will have maximum pressure applied to it. If not outright regime change, like what we just saw, like literally that applied to Iran. And if that's the case, then yeah, oil prices are not going to go down, obviously, because I do think that this time around in 2025, you and I sat here and said Iran's not going to do anything, but that's because Trump was very clear in 25. We don't seek regime change, so do not retaliate in a meaningful way. If he is seeking regime change, then I think all bets are off, and Iran could do all sorts of stuff.
Well, it depends. There's a lot to break apart there. And I also want to push on what you said a little bit, because if let's accept your position on Saudi Arabia for the sake of argument, two other factors that really come in. One is Iran. So what does Iranian oil production look like? Is there regime change? Do you remove the supreme leader and the IRGC is still in charge and not much changes? Then there's also Russia. I mean, you and I have both said that we're thinking there's going to be some kind of resolution to the Russia-Ukraine war in 26. That was another thing we talked about in our forecast episode. If Russia comes in from the cold and suddenly we're not getting sanctions on Russian crude, and Russian crude can get back on the market in a meaningful sense, now you're way oversupplied too. So
But
that starts to go in there.
yeah, I really disagree with those 2 points. Iran and Russia are pretty much producing as much as they can. So like Russian sanctions in many ways matter for their diesel exports, which should lower oil prices. You're right, but not that meaningfully because the fundamental fact is that the sanctions on Russia really don't impact its ability to export oil. It just impacts their ability to get paid for it. And
Right.
so,
I think you're right that
and
supply is not going to meaningfully increase, but you're not going to have Ukrainian drones blowing up Russian oil infrastructure, but the price
so
caps
they've
are
been
meaningful in terms of
right, but
like
like one
price.
interesting thing about right, but one of the interesting things about that is, first of all, if the price cap goes away, technically the global oil price should go up
Mhm.
because technically right now there is some part of global supply that's basically underpriced. If that no longer exists, all the prices should go up very marginally, but they should. The second thing about Ukrainian attacks is that they've been very interesting for the most part until the last attack, which I think did actually specifically attack a pipeline. Most of them have been striking things that have to do with refining. And
Yeah.
that's because Ukrainians have effectively talked to some, oil traders who told them, like, look, what you want is you want Russia to continue to export crude, but you want to make it more difficult for them to refine the crude domestically. And that will actually cause their prices of their exports to go down while making their domestic economy not work. So, I'm not sure that Iran and Russia, no matter what happens with it over the next 12 months, can really add any more supply. Like, if you actually think about OPEC plus policy, like, if Saudi Arabia and UAE agree to cut production, it's kind of game over for the oversupply we have. Um,
Mhm.
Now, why would they do that? Why would they irk President Trump? Obviously, they haven't done it. It's a controversial view. I'm not saying they will, but I do think that the clock is kind of ticking on that Saudi piggy bank that like that you mentioned. The reserves are coming down. Like at some point, I do think they're going to be like, look, we need slightly higher oil prices, and we're not talking $100, $150. We're talking,
Yeah.
70,
Yeah.
which is not crazy.
Crazy.
That's
Yeah. Absolutely. Okay, well, let's get into what happens next before we get into the myths. And there, yes, there's chatter about Iran, but all the public chatter, at least for the last 24 hours, is definitely Greenland. President Trump
yeah.
has said that
I love this.
he needs Greenland from the standpoint of national security. That's a direct quote. Right now, Greenland is covered with Russian and Chinese ships all over the place. Again, quoting the president there. You've got Denmark's Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen, much higher on my global leaderboard than she was on yours, who said in no uncertain terms that if the United States chose to do this, it would be the end of NATO, and it
She
just
said
wouldn't
end of
happen.
everything. She actually
The end of
said it would be
everything.
the end of everything, which I kind of agree. It would be, you know, the beginning of a completely new world.
Yeah, well, here, I'll give you the exact quote. So, if the United States were to choose to attack another NATO country, then everything would come to an end. The international community, as we know it, democratic rules of the game, NATO, the world's strongest defense line, all of that would collapse if one NATO country chose to attack another. Maybe it's misdirection. Maybe he wants to throw in the Greenland thing because he's really thinking about Iran. Cuba is certainly on the table. You've got Rubio, you've got Trump. I don't know if you saw Lindsey Graham foaming at the mouth
Yeah,
about Cuba. I think he was on Air Force One where that
he
interview
was.
was. I mean,
Yeah,
just like going crazy, and that's actually a signal because he was doing the same thing about Maduro
yeah.
right after Christmas. And I even remember I was at this resort with my family, and I opened up Twitter and I looked at it, and he was spouting off about Maduro, and I was like, why does Lindsey Graham give a shit about, like, what is he talking? And apparently he had some insider information. Maybe he's the mysterious poly market trader. I don't know. So let's approach this from a couple different angles. Let's first deal with Iran. Do you think it's Iran? If it is Iran, why do you think it's Iran? And then what does it mean?
Well, the Benjamin Netanyahu Trump meeting was very cordial in the White House. I was also confused why Netanyahu was back in the US, for what purpose. Um, so there's that. Then there were the very curious comments from President Trump over the last 2 weeks before the invasion of Venezuela.
Mm-hmm.
Before the attack, sorry, it's not invasion. Where he said that US would intervene on behalf of the protesters, which is completely outside of like the MAGA philosophy. The whole point of MAGA philosophy is like, look, you can do whatever you want to the people domestically. Like, we don't really give a shit. Just make sure that you do not contravene American interests. And so suddenly President Trump was like, he sounded like Barack Obama or Joe Biden. Don't touch the protesters. It's a very color revolution style verbiage out of President Trump, which was confusing and gave me pause well before the extraordinary success of this operation.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I do think that the odds of American military strikes on Iran are rising, quite precipitously. And so I think that that's really significant. Now, do I think it's going to happen? I don't know. Hard to say. But I do think that the current market setup, like what we do for a living, you and I, with our clients, is just not set up for that. There is just no premium in oil prices at all. Maybe a little bit on Monday. So Monday action. We're recording this on January 6th, the Tuesday. Monday, which was the first trading day after the Venezuelan attack, like oil prices went up, not down, as many in our industry thought they would. So I do think my concept of Chuck Norris premium is clearly there. It's acting. Oil prices should have gone down by some analysis by a lot because of this, wellspring of Venezuelan oil. So I do worry that we are not. I think most people just don't understand the difference between 25 and 26, and maybe in 25, a lot of people became complacent. They were like, well, nothing ever matters. Geopolitics doesn't matter. Israel can attack Iran. Iran can attack Israel. America can bomb Iranian nuclear facilities. What happened? Nothing. There's no. But the reason nothing happened, and this is really, really important, is that Saudi Arabia stayed out of that fight. And the United States of America under President Trump was very, very clear. This was not about regime change, not about regime change. In fact, the US told Israel, we don't want to hear this nonsense. If you had attacks following what just happened in Venezuela, then it is about regime change. I mean, very clearly, it is about that. And then Iran's reaction function will be different. And so I do think this is a big deal. And I think that this is the biggest risk right now to the world economy, to oil prices, to markets, all that stuff, that, President Trump follows up this really great success in Venezuela, which objectively is extraordinary, and just says like, look, I can keep doing this. This works. Delta forces are awesome. We got Chuck Norris.
I mean, I would say it's objectively mid, but that's fine, because if he does to Iran what he did to Venezuela, what that looks like is you helicopter the supreme leader to an aircraft carrier in the Gulf, and you have ties in the IRGC who take over. It's very clear what's happened in Venezuela. You've got this vice president,
No, I hear you. I hear you.
Delcy,
But
who
yeah,
they had in position. And if you've got ties into the IRGC who have problems with the supreme leader, goes with the humiliation, then this is relatively unimportant. If though,
yeah,
if it
I
really
agree.
is regime change, like you're talking about, then we are in a very different world. And here, like the counterfactual, I think, to what you're saying is this has happened before in Iran. We get protests in Iran fairly often. The Iranian diaspora is very loud and wants to make a big deal out of it. Israel is very loud and wants to make a big deal about it. I'm sure you saw the report in the Times over the weekend about how the supreme leader has an exit plan to go to Moscow in case things get really bad. Maduro didn't accept his exit plan to Turkey. I'm sure the supreme leader would get himself out of Dodge if things were really going badly. But that to me sounds like a drumbeat, a media drumbeat to try and force action. It doesn't. I don't see any signs of defection from security forces or anything like that. Where I mean, we didn't call this out at the time, but if you go back and read like open source over the past 3 to 6 months, it is interesting how much U.S. negotiators and officials talked about Delcy, that
Yeah,
Venezuela vice president, how they said she was
yeah,
constructive, they had good conversations with
yep.
her. Like that's not happening with the IRGC.
No, but
So
that's why it's a risk, right? Because you're absolutely right. Like, what happened if it was not regime change? Although I don't know, it is. It kind of is. Like
sort of. We'll see. Like it's not done yet. Like
it's.
Machado said, she's going to go down and run in elections if she gets elected in 3 months. Yes, it is regime change, but we're a
I
long
would
way yet.
say I would say it's like regime recalibration in a significant way from an American perspective. From the perspective of the Venezuelan people, doesn't seem like it. But from an American perspective, it's pretty huge. I just because I don't believe that that's an option in Iran. I think it's then a greater risk. I think Iranian regime, broadly conceived, will fight back or will try to impose costs on the U.S. for interfering domestically in its politics. Right. So that's where this goes offline. A lot of liberal criticism of what happened in Venezuela is focused on Venezuela. It's focused on forever wars. It's focused on like we're going to run Venezuela and that comment. And I've dispelled that as nonsense. Like the U.S. is not running Venezuela. Come on, like pump the brakes, relax, guys, take a chill pill. That's not going to happen. Nothing that happened in Venezuela is really a problem, right? And you identified too this whole like hysteria about international law. Give me a break, like that's been going on for 30 years. The real issue is that if this scenario, which is unique to Venezuela, it is not really applicable almost anywhere else. If that's applied to Iran, I think that's where this gets really, really bad. And that's usually how politicians and policymakers make mistakes. They take one success and apply it to something else. I would argue that that's how we got into the mess in Iraq. Afghanistan was easy. It
Yeah.
encouraged Bush, like, hey, look, we can just go around like changing regimes in 2 weeks.
Well, and to play devil's advocate with myself, I mean, I don't think Iran can impose meaningful costs. We just watched Israel kick the shit out of them. If the United States decides it really wants to take off the gloves with Iran, I mean, they haven't been able to rebuild anything in the
So
last couple of months. So
I
I don't know.
really disagree with that. Like
Okay.
again, and here's why. Iran, kind of like North Korea, like these are, and forget the fact that North Korea actually has nukes. Both North Korea and Iran have meaningful ways to really mess up your life. The problem is that once they use them, they've crossed the red line and then they get carpet bombed into a parking lot. So the reason that Iran didn't do anything last year, and what can it do? It can load up thousands and thousands of dinghies and Zodiac boats with explosives and shut down the Strait of Hormuz. Very low cost, very cheap way to interrupt shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. Iran can do that. Now, the United States
For how
Navy, the
long?
Fifth Fleet, well, yeah, I mean, like perhaps not long, maybe weeks, but enough to cause a pretty significant disruption in the global economy. So that's the first. The second thing it can do is it can attack, and this is more permanent, it can actually attack and destroy Saudi Arabian energy facilities and transportation. And also it can do that in Iraq, which is 4 times more, well, actually more like 5, 6 times more important than Venezuela in terms of global oil supply. I mean, it takes like literally one switch. There's one export terminal in Basra, one pipe that you can blow up,
Yeah.
and 4 million barrels goes offline. So there's ways that Iran can do this in a very low cost way, and there's nothing US can do about those Zodiac boats. American frigates are not going to be chasing around a Zodiac boat filled with TNT. What the US would do is it would start carpet bombing Iran. like, like completely destroying the country, turning it into a parking lot in order to impose punitive pain on the regime so that the regime then says, okay, fine, we cry uncle, it's over. The problem is how long are Iranians willing to incur that pain? I mean, a country like Serbia in 1999 basically withstood 3 months worth of epic like bombardment that turned the country into, like Wesley Clark said, we're gonna, go medieval on them. The US did.
Yeah, but you guys are
Milosevic,
crazy, Marco.
but like I don't know, man. I've played a lot of basketball with my Persian brothers. Let me tell you, Serbs and Persians, like we are in that same level of mental fortitude. So I do think that this could last a lot longer than people think. Again, the reason this didn't happen in 25 and the reason that our analysis last year was not just out of nowhere. I mean, it had to do with the fact that Israel could not impose regime change on Iran and the fact that the US didn't want to. So
Yeah.
that gave Iran the confidence that, if they played within some red lines that America imposed on them, things would be fine. Things would be fine for the regime. They could declare victory as they did. I think this time around, that's where this is significantly different from last year. And that's why I am worried about this. I think it's the biggest risk to everything.
Yeah, I hear you. I'm not going to dismiss it. I'm not. I'm going to look elsewhere. But I thought about the Iran attacking Saudi facilities too. It'd be interesting to see if the Saudis know how to use all those F-35s that they purchased. Okay, we got to get to the miss. But before we get to the miss,
Yeah.
let's just talk briefly Greenland and
Yeah,
Mexico.
Greenland. You brought up Greenland. I think it's
what happens if the U.S. takes Greenland? Because that would not take a whole lot. I mean, that would take two. I mean, how many helicopters would it take? Over under two? Like, I think it would be pretty easy. What would it mean? I mean, do you think it's going to happen? What does it mean for NATO? I mean, to me, that would be in some ways. I mean, I agree with you that Iran has a potential for more disruption. I just can't believe that the Trump administration would do that to Iran unless they had an inside angle like they do in Venezuela. But maybe I'm giving them too much credit. Greenland is very different because he can literally snap his fingers and do that tomorrow if he wants. And then we're talking about, I mean, I don't know how many more wake up calls Europe needs. But I mean, if you think European defense stocks have, been levitating for the past year or two, let's see the United States take Greenland, what happens to Rheinmetall and some of these other names in general, or to European supply chains or the U.S.-Europe relationship. I don't know. Do you think it's realistic, or do you think it's just all a bunch of PR nonsense?
Look, I don't think it is realistic. I mean, even among NATO allies, there's a continuum of countries in terms of how allied they are to the U.S. And I think we both understand and agree. And I know a lot of listeners are not going to understand this point, but like Denmark is an American ally, staunch American ally, and has been always. So this is it's not like France, it's not like Italy, definitely not like Spain.
Mm-hmm.
This is a staunch American ally, no matter who's in charge of the country. And so I just don't see this happening. Already some Republicans in Congress are starting to say like, hey, pipe it down. We don't need this kind of talk. So I don't think it's going to happen. I do think that what we need to understand is that, number one, Trump loves to troll the libs. Loves it. Loves it. He bathes in it. The way I bathe in aloof indifference, he bathes in the tears of liberals, first and foremost. The second thing is I think that now that this Venezuela action was so successful, and this is where I'm going to be wrong about Iran, by the way. Now that it was so successful, I think that what President Trump is going to do is he's going to just threaten it for everything. If he wants his bread buttered in a certain way, he's going to be like, I'm going to do regime change, put more butter. You know what I mean? Like this is what he does. He will do something and then he will use that to gain leverage in other negotiations with other countries. I don't know what that will be with Denmark and Greenland. Maybe he wants some concessions for rare earths or some nonsense or whatever it is. I don't really know. But the reality is that now that this happened in Venezuela, knowing how President Trump negotiates, I just think he's going to keep bringing it up all the freaking time.
Yeah. Well, first of all, you said that Trump likes to bathe in the tears of liberals. It's ironic because Trump is a liberal himself. Yes, I said it, MAGA supporters. Go check the receipts. Go look at the policies that he supports.
But that's why he loves it, though.
I know. That's why he loves it. And it's
Y-
the most amazing thing about his charisma is that he's convinced everyone that he's a conservative, but he's deeply liberal on so many different issues. Like he's closer to Bernie than he is to what a traditional conservative leader would do. Politico had some quotes that would push back against what you said. Like they have like folks from Denmark and other European defense officials saying, "Look, we've offered them more U.S. military presence. We've offered them concessions. They're not interested. They just keep on talking about how they want to take it." You had Stephen Miller's wife posting a picture of a map of Greenland with the U.S. flag superimposed on it, and he's frothing at them out there too. I tend to agree with you that it seems unrealistic, but let's say, for the sake of argument, let's say it happens. Is it the end of NATO? Is it the end of everything? What does Denmark do if the United States decides to appoint, some kind of, I don't know, provincial governor of Greenland and takes over? Like, what are the next steps if that does actually happen?
well, I mean, I think it would be the end of everything. This would be, it would be basically America declaring that it is no longer part of the West. Or as the national security strategy inferred, it's not that America is no longer part of the West, it's that Europe has failed the West itself, right? Civilizational erasure is what it was the term. But
Mm-hmm.
so I do think it would be incredibly profound. One thing I do want to mention is that you can't really annex a territory. You can't add territory to the United States of America without congressional approval. There is no path for that. And it has to be with 2/3 majority, from what I understand. I'm not a legal scholar. I'm not a constitutional scholar, but
Marco, I would refer you to this wonderful book called Geopolitical Alpha, in
oh yeah,
which this wonderful geopolitical analyst, Marco Papich, goes in and says all these stupid laws that everybody says are constraints are not laws, because if Donald Trump wakes up tomorrow morning and decides he wants green, you think he's going to be stopped because it's illegal? The
wow, that was a
tariffs were
deep
illegal
reference.
too. Did he stop the tariffs because the tariffs are technically illegal?
Well, we do have a Supreme Court ruling on it.
And they'll find something else. Like the tariffs are in place, even though they're illegal. They'll be in place for years,
In
even though
that
that they're
case,
illegal.
yes. In that case, I can see that. Anyways, look, I agree with you. When I talk about constraints in the book, I add legal constitutional ones as the last one, right? Almost as a punchline. I make fun of them. Um, but the issue is that it's not laws, it's not constitution that matters. What matters is that there's a vehicle for American establishment and elites to reject this. There's an actual way for them to do that. So it's really it's a geopolitical and a political reality that will be manifested through the laws. So that's why the fact that you can just read chatter, statements from Republicans who are saying we're not going to do this. We're not going to go against an American ally. That's where I think it matters. So yes, you're right. Like if this was just about legality, then who cares, right? But there's actual political will to stand up to President Trump, unlike what happened with the tariffs. I think. Could be wrong. What do you think?
I was just
Does the
looking at
Republican
Polymarket
Party,
here.
does the
So will the U.S.
Republican market go along?
Well, I don't think it matters. Until the midterms, I think this is Trump's party. The midterms might meaningfully dent Trump's power, but this is Trump's party, and the Republicans who want to be there are there. I mean, Marjorie Taylor Greene got on the wrong side of President Trump, and she's gone. I don't think anybody's going to stand up to him at this point. Maybe it's different in the midterms, but all these Republicans are terrified that Trump is going to primary them from the MAGA camp and that he's going to support some type of competitor. So unless you're a lame duck Mitch McConnell, you don't really have the luxury, I think, of bucking the White House right now. Polymarket has will the U.S. invade Greenland in 2026? It's up to 11% yes. It was as low as 6% before. And will there be U.S. strikes on Iran? It's 16% chance by January 31st, 36% chance by June 30th.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
interesting little moves to watch, especially in the context of somebody making a big bet about Maduro. And to respond to some of the listeners, it was not me. I did not have that information. I did not make hundreds of thousands of dollars on Polymarket with the Venezuela strike. More's the pity. Okay, we got to keep it tight. Should we move on to myths?
Yeah. I mean, I can do mine fairly quickly.
Let's do
But
it.
we should do one after another. So, yeah. So, look, we already handled that Venezuela can't really wash the world with oil. The three things I want to say is, first and foremost, there is this. So where did these myths come from, by the way? I'll tell you. For those of you who have kind of missed the early episodes of Geopolitical Alpha, both Jacob and I work in finance. So our clients are investors. We do this as a fun thing on the side. And you can think of these myths as my version of Bill Simmons's mailbag. These are basically questions I get from my clients. And sometimes the questions you get from clients are pretty out there. One of them in particular, I was forwarded this analysis by a gentleman whose name I will not mention because I don't want to be mean to anyone, but it was a particularly conspiratorial view that the op against Venezuela has nothing to do with drugs. It has nothing to do with oil. It has to do with the fact that the United States of America cannot abide by presence of foreign powers in the Western Hemisphere, given the technological innovation of underwater, basically drones. So what's happening in the Black Sea is really significant. Ukraine is out there using drones to go after Russian shipping. And if Russia were to retaliate by putting its own underwater drones in Cuba and Venezuela, the US shipping and energy security in the Gulf would be threatened. To which I say, there's nothing new about that notion. I mean, literally, we got 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis because of a very similar thing. And the second thing is, no. And the reason I say no is because it's not 1986, it's 2026. Venezuela and Cuba have agency. They have a mind of their own. And the United States of America is not, stupid. It's not like it would be like, oh, I wonder why that tanker blew up. It will be figured out where the explosion came from. And then Venezuela and Cuba will be carpet bombed. Carpet bombed. And behind them is not the Soviet Union. There's no Soviet Union to be like, whoa, you can't do that. We'll nuke you. It's Russia. So, myth, stupid, no. Can we please stop with this nonsense that somehow Cuba and Venezuela are, basically just vestigial, limbs of American enemies? They are authoritarian states trying to stay alive. And yes, they have support from countries like Iran, Russia, and China, but no, they have a mind of their own. And we saw how quickly that mind reasserts itself when Maduro's out. Desi Rodriguez apparently is good. Maduro bad, Desi good. So I think this is nonsense. The military buildup in the Caribbean has nothing to do with Russian underwater vehicles or anything else. It has to do with President Trump wanting to change Venezuela's outlook. That's it.
I think you can I think you can make your argument even sharper by saying it's not Venezuela, it's not Cuba, and then it's also not Iran. Remember, the reason that we have the Iran that we have today is because in 1953, we got rid of Mohammad Mossadegh, the democratically elected leader of Iran in the context of the Cold War, and we had a couple decades of the Shah doing whatever we wanted, and then the Iranian people got sick of it, you get the revolution, and now we have the current regime. So Kim Jong-un is also a product of this. The Korean War is a product of the initial stages of the Cold War. It's not normal for the Korean Peninsula to be divided. So in some sense, it really is, I like what you said about it, like these vestigial conflicts that are just sitting out there. It's almost like the Trump administration just playing whack-a-mole with all of the leftover Cold War conflicts and just updating them a little bit for future episodes of the reality TV show.
I think the reason there's so many conspiracy theories is because people can't abide by the notion that these countries have agency. That's the biggest mistake that people, Kim Jong-un is just doing Xi Jinping's bidding. If Xi Jinping had his way, Kim Jong-un would be on Mars. You know what I mean? It's just complete nonsense that somebody's pulling the strings. It doesn't work that way. Maduro and the Chavez regime are the Chavistas. They're not Russian. They're not a Russian spy. Now, that said, yes, Monroe Doctrine exists even back as early as 1823 because of this risk. Because these are risks. They are footholds in American sphere of influence. So there is some notion, there's some sense that this isn't completely idiotic thesis. But no, Venezuela and Cuba are not going to host Russian underwater vehicles because the United States of America would know that they're there, and then the pain that would be imposed upon them would be existential.
Yeah. All right. Well, my first myth, then I'll start with this one because I think it dovetails with yours. And it'll be one of my favorite whipping boys is The Economist. Here is a title of a recent Economist article. America's raid on Venezuela reveals the limits of China's reach. It is not a template for Taiwan, but a reality check on China's global power. Turn on the TikTok camera. Look close into my eyes if you're watching on YouTube. This has nothing to do with China. This changes absolutely nothing for China. It changes nothing about their Latin America strategy. It changes nothing about their Taiwan strategy. It changes relatively little about where they're importing oil from. Maybe they'll substitute a couple barrels here for a couple barrels there. It means absolutely nothing. Now, if the US says no more Chinese ships can go through the Panama Canal, okay, you have my attention. I will be listening. But getting rid of Maduro and putting in place Vice President Rodriguez and agreeing to fix all of this Venezuelan oil infrastructure, which should eventually, maybe it'll take years or decades, but should eventually bring a lot more supply on the market. China likes that. The United States is going to fit the bill for the infrastructure, and we don't have to deal with these kleptocratic, thuggish, authoritarian guys who would just default on our money. China's been trying to claw back the loans it gave to Venezuela for years now because they realized it was a bad investment. None of this matters for China. And in the meantime, they're trading with Peru. They're building ports in Peru. They're trading with Argentina. They're trading with Brazil. Their ships are all over the place and have not been impeded by anything that the United States is doing. And they are not going to invade Taiwan in the next 24 months just because we helicoptered a dude out of Caracas. Stop. Please stop. I think I said this in the interview yesterday, Marco, but you remember that earthquake in Taiwan a couple of years ago? There was a Bloomberg article where the first 3 paragraphs were about the earthquake. This is what happened. Here's the semiconductor facilities that got damaged, blah, blah, blah. And the 4th paragraph was, and could this be the moment that China takes advantage of Taiwan's weakness to conquer the island once and for all? I'm paraphrasing a little bit. It doesn't matter what the story is. If it is tangentially related to China, the media will say, this is about China's reach. It's about moving and revanchist moves to try and take over things, and their power is limited. This is not a China story. It has nothing to do with China. In the limited sense it has anything to do with China, China might have to find a different place to import a couple 100,000 barrels of oil per day. End of
Oh
story.
no, the horror. Well, that leads to my second myth, which is exactly kind of the same, which is the other conspiracy theory that the United States of America had to seek permission from Russia and Venezuela. Again, this comes from my mailbag. Client questions. Again, usually clients read a note written by someone who will be in business for 18 months. And then they forward me the note. So there's apparently a meeting between Russia and US where in 2019, Sergei Lavrov proposed that they flip Venezuela for Ukraine, which is nonsense. Like, again, Venezuela this isn't the Cold War. Russia's not the Soviet Union. You cannot just exchange territory because Russia does not have the influence in Venezuela with which to give it up to the United States of America. And which part of the operation over the weekend were the Russians like to be thanked for? Like, did they turn off their S-400s? Like, what is it that the Russians would have done to help America? Like, so no, this is, and also, like, what is America going to give Russia? Russia's already pretty much conquered 90% of what they can meaningfully conquer in Ukraine. There's this part of Donetsk they're still trying to get. Like, what is America going to give Russia? The rest of Ukraine, eastern Ukraine, everything east of the river Dnieper? Yeah, there's something in a way. What is it? Ukrainians. So no, this is not how the world works. Again, people who write these things, they played like too much risk, They in their life, they've played too many board games. They think that every country is a billiard ball that can just be moved. United States of America did not get permission from Russia and China to do anything. Now, why are Russia and China relatively quiet about what just happened? Well, Russia has no means with which to counter it. Russian aircraft carrier Admiral Kuznetsov has been breaking down for like the last 20 years. The thing is a joke. It has no power projection capabilities beyond the Eurasian kind of landmass. And even there, we've seen, obviously, them get bogged down in Ukraine. And China, just as you pointed out, kind of doesn't care. But low-key, where maybe I disagree with you a little bit, they're just sitting there in the back and saying, like, okay, well, maybe 5, 10, 15 years from now, maybe the Taiwanese president needs to be criminal in charge.
Oh yes, yes, yes. I agree with that. Like they're basically watching the United States dismantle the liberal international order for them. Especially
for
if they
them.
go up to
Yes,
Greenland, it's done. It's like
done.
it's
No, no, no. And by the way, that is not even a counter to you. That's like en passant. Obviously, you're
yeah.
going to do that. But look, the point is that this is the other myth that I've heard a lot. A lot of people think that there's some sort of a deal with Ukraine, and I'm like, what does it mean? Like America is just going to stop sending weapons to Ukraine? What exactly? Which, by the way, has not happened. That
Hmm.
actually has not happened. And by the way, even if it does, Europeans have plenty of weapons and money. They really do. Everyone listening to this, most of you are American. You're like, no, they don't. Yeah, they do. They do. Ukrainians are going to be fine. What is America going to give Russians in return for a supposed gift of Venezuela? Total nonsense, myth. Stop listening to people who propagate this stuff.
All right, my second myth. I'm going to go here. I mean, I could pick any number of public intellectuals, anybody else with this, but I'm going to pick on Minority Leader of the House of Representatives, Hakeem Jeffries, who I will now quote. In describing the U.S. operation to kidnap Maduro or arrest Maduro, he said, quote, "This wasn't a law enforcement action. They're lying to the American people when they say that. It was an unprecedented military action," end quote. If you just Google unprecedented in Venezuela, you will be awash in stories about how what the United States just did to Venezuela is completely unprecedented. And if you think that, so Mr. Jeffries, if you or any of your staff are listening, if you think that if you or somebody out there who thinks this is unprecedented, may I please refer you to the history of U.S. intervention in countries like Honduras, Nicaragua, the Dominican Republic, Guatemala, Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, Argentina, and Chile. And I may have even missed a few. You will find U.S. both covert and overt military actions, whether it's the CIA trying to depose people or Marines going in and killing people or going into Panama and kidnapping presidents or taking over Grenada, everything else. Just look at the sordid history of U.S. imperialism in Latin America. If you know even like an infinitesimal amount about U.S. behavior in Latin America, you would not use the word unprecedented. Anybody who says that is like they're not a moron because obviously they're smart. They've just chosen to bathe not in aloof indifference, Marco, but in ignorance. They've just
Ignorance.
decided to pretend like history and US behavior over the past 100 years doesn't matter, doesn't exist. All that matters is what we say about ourselves today. And as you can tell, I'm going to burn off what's left of my hair because it makes me so mad.
No, listen, and listen. And this is not just random people. Okay, this is liberals, almost exclusively. And here's why I say that. Because in 1999, when NATO bombed Serbia for 3 months, that was illegal according to the international law. Like just the fact that like, at the time, I think 24 member states of NATO, with Greece abstaining, decided to say it was okay, does not make it legal. China and its cronies, if they decide to bomb Taiwan, that doesn't make it legal. And at the time, that was a liberal intervention. Samantha Power, who went on to be the U.S.
Yeah.
ambassador to the UN, she loved that humanitarian intervention. There's a whole slew of political scientists who loved this. It's responsibility to protect. We have a responsibility to protect human beings, and so we will bomb the crap out of this country that was kind of mean and evil for most of the 1990s. Let alone the fact that, meanwhile, Turkey, a NATO member state, at the same time was suppressing the Kurds in just as much of a violation of humanitarian law. But that doesn't matter. They're a NATO member state, so we're going to pick this one right here. And there was all sorts of nonsense argued at the time by folks like Power. Like, oh, well, yes, we can't intervene everywhere at all the time, but we can intervene here, so we should. And of course, the very simple answer to at that time was like, if you justify this intervention right now, right here, somebody else will justify it using the same terms, which is why I found it quite hilarious that Sergei Lavrov justified the Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008 using the same responsibility to protect language. Tbilisi failed in its responsibility to protect its people, And so fast forward to 2026, and suddenly this is unprecedented. No, it's not. Not only is this not unprecedented because other presidents have done this. Not only is it not unprecedented, don't be throwing me George W. Bush and George H.W. Bush. Don't be giving me conservative Republican presidents. Bill Clinton did this illegally in 1999. No UN support, nothing. Like flimsy, like, oh yeah, well, there's some conflict in Kosovo we need to prevent. Like,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
what?
Who started us down this garden path? Harry Truman and the Korean police operation. Who had the Gulf of Tonkin? LBJ. It is both parties love to do this.
And the reason that I think, but the reason that it's important to put this on the liberals is because it makes sense when right-wing hawks do it. You know what I mean? And this is where I thought everybody should watch Jon Stewart's Daily Show had a great examination of what just happened. And it was funny because he says, okay, I want to hear President Trump give us that human rights, that kind of like idealistic reason we're in this. And then every clip is Trump just being like, we want the oil, you know? And it was hilarious because in some way, obviously, there's a lot of problems with that. It's callous, it's imperialistic, and it will incentivize other countries to act callously and imperialistically. But at the very least, there's a modicum of respect for that kind of honesty, which is the first time that the US has probably just been brutally honest. Like, nah, we just want the oil.
Yeah.
You know?
No, I'm on record as saying that I appreciate the forthright vulgarity. It works.
Anyways, I think that that was going to be my third myth as well, actually.
Oh, okay. That's your third myth. All right.
Yeah,
My
my third myth.
Go ahead.
No, I just wanted to bring up the fact that, look, you cannot justify illegal action when, according to your sensibilities, it's well-meaning. Because they're your sensibilities. Nobody gives a shit what you think. And that includes people like Samantha Power. Sorry. Like, you do not get to decide what is morally correct. That's why we have laws. And that's why in political science, a lot of constructivist and liberal thinking is wrong, because the only thing that does actually matter is power. It's not international law. The United States of America and every great power has been breaking international law since international law was written. So let's stop pretending that, number one, it matters, and number two, that you're doing something because out of the goodness of your heart.
Yeah, we're not even following U.S. constitutional law, let alone international law. So let's not focus on that. All right, my last myth. I didn't know much about the U.S. invasion of Panama in 1989, and I was doing some reading on it. We had one piece of hate mail from somebody on social media, which I don't over-index on this too much, but who said I have these tortured historical metaphors for things. If you don't want tortured historical metaphors related to modern politics, you're in the wrong podcast.
You're in the wrong podcast.
This is yes. we began this conversation
That's
with
all we do.
Comparing notes on our relative skill at Age of Empires. Like, we've got Muppets on the podcast art, as Marco likes to point out. Like, that's what you're here for. So, and it's okay, by the way. Like, one of my best friends listens to the podcast to fall asleep. Like, there are many different uses for the recordings that we put out there. But there were some key differences when I started looking at the history of Panama in 1989. The biggest difference was Panama declared a state of war against the United States. This wasn't like Maduro, who was willing to apparently give President Trump a lot of what he wanted. But the Panamanian government had declared a state of war against America. They had killed a U.S. Marine, wounded another, beaten a third, and his wife. There wasn't technically congressional action to explicitly authorize military force, but there was congressional action to authorize unilateral American action to get rid of Noriega, who was the leader at the time, once a U.S. ally, and sort of push back against it. When you start looking at it too, like, there was also this explicit U.S. goal of restoring democratic governance. That's not there when it comes to Venezuela at all. Panama is a tiny little country, roughly 3 million people. Venezuela is a very large country with a very complex political, geographic, military landscape. And yet, by the way, more U.S. soldiers died invading Panama than they did in absconding with Maduro. And the other thing was that there was a political opposition in Panama ready to govern. So by getting rid of Noriega, you get to elections, you get a new government. There was a path there. That's not necessarily true in Venezuela. Now, it looks like, Vice President Delcy Rodriguez, as we've talked about, was the next thing. But that's just substituting one Chavista for another. That's not, there's a political opposition. If we topple the guy who's gotten too big for his own britches, we return, a semblance of Panamanian democracy. to itself. This is just, like Maduro made fun of us. We want the Chavista who's going to let us operate the oil fields, and we'll be good. And after that, it's up to Venezuela. Just don't mess with our oil and what we're doing in the oil field. So, not necessarily a myth, sort of a myth. Like the fact that it was just like Panama 1989, actually some critical differences, and I thought it was worthwhile to say that.
I thought that one of the ways that you pointed out it was different is by referring to the other myth, which just
I know.
it was
Self-referential.
oh
Tortured historical metaphors. It's not just historical metaphors. They're going to be tortured and
they're gonna be
circuitous
tortured.
and sinewy, and that's what you're here for. I can't believe anybody's complaining.
All right, cool. Well, yeah, I mean, my final myth, as I said, was going to be about oil, but we already handled that. So, yeah, I'm out of myths. I think it is interesting. One thing I do want to say is that in moments like this, there's a tendency for a lot of people to become like the uncle at Thanksgiving dinner.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by that is that everything is connected. There's all these links that need to be articulated, it's like somebody in a basement with a map and a lot of threads and tacks, like on some very complicated storyline. And the truth is that sometimes this is really just about America and Venezuela. Or, as President Trump has honestly and refreshingly said, I just want the oil. It is what it is.
The problem with that, like, if that's true, then I really do worry about Greenland because he's got the oil now. You know what he doesn't have? Rare earths. And he's been beating that drum for literally since day one in office,
The problem with rare earths, and you and I have articulated this before, oil is oil, right? You got to get the oil where it is. Rare earths are everywhere. You and I probably have some rare earths under our feet right now.
Yeah.
The problem, even if we get rare earths out of Ukraine with that idiotic deal, which nobody talks about anymore because everyone realized is that I'm right. That's an idiotic deal. Greenland, ton of rare earths, apparently. You can get rare earths in California. The problem is refining them. So what are we going to do? We're going to break apart the military alliance that has secured the planet for 80 years so that we can get rare earths in a frozen wasteland of Greenland and then ship it to China to be refined. Rare earths are not rare. Their refining is the problem because it's all done in China. So no, the solution to the rare earth shortage is not in getting more rare earths. It's in getting refining capacity outside of China. And you're not going to put that in Greenland, a country or a territory of 50,000 people.
I think you're right, obviously, but yeah. We shall see.
We shall see. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks a lot, Jacob. This was a quick one, but I think.
Yeah, a quick one for us for the record is over an hour, but I think it'll, we're working hard for you. We'll see y'all later this week.